Hi guys, today we're gonna see some new effect. This is the effect that we're gonna see. It's interaction with the ground and producing particles and smoke out of them. There are a few elements of this effect. There is the smoke and there are the rocks. We will see how this is made. So first of all, I have this generated Mixamo model with an animation. This is the girl with the animation, and this is the setup that I used to create the smoke and also the rocks. So first of all, I started off with picking up just part of her legs because that's the only part that is interacting with the floor. I brought them a bit lower so they can touch the ground level at all times, because at some point she is a bit higher than the ground. And there are two separate networks that I'm creating here. One part, the right part, is actually creating the velocity field, and the left part is actually transferring the velocity and the mask onto the ground. So first we're gonna see the left part. I'm using the trailing node just to compute the velocities. You can see her movement, and the velocities are generating between each frame. The velocity that is tracking those 2 points from the previous frame to the next frame. Then I'm just putting another element, another copy of the same animation, just to have it a bit longer trail behind her. And I'm also taking with the velocities and everything. And I create an attribute, it's called active. This attribute, I will use it later as a mask. On the other hand, I'm creating a grid node geometry, and I'm scattering points onto it. You can choose the scattering size as you wish. It depends on how long is the trail and how much points you need or you want. Then, because we have this velocity from the right side and we have these points on the left side, we can transfer this velocity with the attribute transfer node. So if you see, the velocities from the girl are transferred to the ground level and onto the floor, and you can control the conditions. So this is the radius. I lower the radius, and this is the blending width. Actually, it's like blurring the mask, and those are values that you're gonna set up according to your project and the size of your project and elements. You can define what actually you're transferring. You can say that you're transferring the V value, the velocity value, to the points, and now you can use the active node just to blast out the points. And actually we can do this in a different way. For example, we don't need the all the points, so you can either do it in this way, if the length of the velocity is lower than 0.2, you can remove the point from the first input, which is actually our points, and all those points to be removed. In this case, you don't even need the active attribute that we created, so you can also delete it. Then we randomize a little bit the velocity, so you can either do it with attribute randomize, or you can do it with noise attribute, which will do the same. And you can just scale the element and play with the amplitude of the vector, and whether to be in every axis or whatever axis you want it to be, the amplitude applied to. And now that we have a randomized velocity, we can use those points to generate new particles out of this. And you can see that I'm generating particles here from the interactive points, and it's a pretty simple network. So I'm using a classic pop network with a force and just a short lifespan of the particles and a little bit of variation of those. I'm using a bit higher number on births of the particles, and I put just a little bit of variance onto the particles there. As a pop force, I put just some amplitude, because this is like a really short lifespan that the particles are having, so you need a bigger amplitude to affect the overall look of the volume after that. And to control the particles a bit better, I put the pop track, which actually it's like air resistance. It adds air resistance, so usually it's on 1. You can change it if you want it, but without the pop track, if you see, they will fly off a bit more. This is visible when they live longer, but even here you can see how much they're prolongate. But without it, the trails will be a bit shorter. And there is also a collision that I'm using here. You can set it off, the collision with the ground, because I'm using the ground plane as a colliding body, just not to have generated particles beneath the surface. I also, after this, when I generate the particles, if you want to see how large their scale is, you can put it in the geometry into the disk option, and you can see that they have quite a large scale. So in a way to adjust this, I'm using the p-scale ramp. So I'm normalizing their age, and I'm using this because now it's normalized from 0 to 1. Now I can create a ramp and use this value, this attribute D, and I can also colorize this those particles from the same D value, which is from 0 to 1. So the 1 is the longest living particles, it's white, and 0, black, are the just born particles that we have. And you will get the both ramps underneath. So you're gonna generate one that is for the P scale. So whatever you put here, you will define the look of it. Usually I put a bigger value on the beginning, just so that I can have a bigger volume here generated where she is touching the ground, and just dissipate at the ends. Normally you can play with it, and the color is up to you, so you can even use ramp color just to adjust these settings. After this, I generate the density field onto the particles, and you can make a marker for those. So it's a color marker, and you can just write density because it's a density field. And just apply it, and it will show it here. So you can see that this is like a mask, this is the amplitude, and this is the element size that we are playing. This is just generating some additional noise, which will let us generate the smoke a little bit more naturally, and get different shapes everywhere. And I'm also generating a noise for the temperature, just to have a little bit more variations there. So you can also put here like a smaller element size, so on different parts you will have lower or higher values. And you need to in order to be used those elements into the Python solver, you need to rasterize those attributes. So we're rasterizing the density, the temperature, and the velocity from the points. And now you can add additional velocity field. So this is the velocity field that we are adding, and this is the network we didn't show, but actually from the beginning, you remember we had this the legs. I have the whole pattern of trailing. I have 37 or 40 frames, yes, 37 frames of animation. So I'm taking all of them, I'm freezing them at the last frame. So I'm freezing them on the 37th frame, which is the longest part of the animation, and I'm creating a bounding box around it. So now I generated a bounding box around the whole animation, which is the good part, and I will not have a bounding box that is expanding throughout the time as the animation goes bigger and bigger. And I'm creating points from this volume. This needs to be like a closed surface, so I'm creating points out of it. You can define the point separation and also jitter a little bit the position of the points. If you don't jitter the position, it will just have a straight line, which is something you want to escape. And I'm defining here the P scale, which is not necessary, but you can define it if you need it. And I'm transferring the attributes from the trailing legs that we saw it here, that we had it, if you remember, and we are transferring onto the points into the air. So this is another velocity field, because this is velocity that is gonna affect the volume and gonna make the feeling that the girl is actually going through that volume. So it's an additional velocity field, and we are rasterizing those attributes and merging them all together with the geometry and with the bottom points and density and temperature. And I'm time shifting it just a little bit behind, because I want to have the velocity to be generated at just a half frame later, so that we can have this like a real trail behind the girl. And now I create a pyro solver, which is pretty fast for solving such animation volumes. And in this pyro solver, I'm using the generated geometry, temperature and velocity, and also I'm generating the collision body, which is the grid on the bottom. I'm creating grid, I'm poly extruding it just to have enough thickness to prevent the volume to go beneath, and I'm reversing it just to have the normals facing outwards, and I'm converting it bit a bit from polygons, because that's what it requires into the collision second input. So you also have those setups here. For example, you can also create setup SDF collision. It will also generate you an SDF node, which will just require additional geometry here to be plugged in. And you can always use those quick setups to set it up your pyro solver. And now I'm always connecting the voxel size with my rasterize attribute size, just to have them both with the same voxel size, because the default shapes from which we are generating the volumes should not have any lower resolution of voxels or bigger size voxels in this case than what we're creating, because if you're generating from a lower size voxels, then whatever you put here, it doesn't matter, because you're generating from a pretty low voxel resolution, and it's gonna look not that high of a quality. So make sure you either match those, or you can even put this voxel size a bit higher. For example, like this. This one can go higher, but please don't make it lower than your default resolution. So when you adjusted the voxel size, here by default, when you set up the collision, create an SDF collision, this will set it up those values as well for you. So whatever is the SDF and the velocity and the volume velocity, it will create a collision here. The sourcing is actually all the attributes that you had for the sourcing that we managed to get them here, and also the velocity field from the points and from the right side. So in the sourcing tab we had the density as a density field, and you can set up this as you prefer. This is how much to multiply the density field when it's generating. This is the temperature. Here you adjust the strength of the temperature. In this case I'm using the pull function just because it works better for me not to push the volume too much on the outside. I'm using the burn and flame, which for this case we are not really using it because we don't have that attribute, but we have the velocity attributes and we use it as vel for the volumes. Volumes always have the vel for their velocities, and I'm also pulling it, setting up on pull, which actually gives me a bit more control, as with the acceleration strength and deceleration strength you can actually define how far the volume will go and when it will start to lose its strength. So it's good for to having a good control on the volume. On fields, I'm just using the dissipation. It's on 0.1, and flame, which we're not having it at this moment. You can turn it off. It's by default. On the shape, I'm having the buoyancy on 0.01 because I already have the velocity on all the points and the outside velocity that I'm using from the girl, so I don't really need that much buoyancy, just to have the upward direction, that's it. And I'm putting a bit of disturbance. It gives the volume a bit more definition, and it makes it look a bit more defined and high res. You can play with those settings as your likings. And I always use the turbulence nose just to give it up even more shape on the volume. So the disturbances are usually for the small details. Turbulences are usually the bigger, finer swirls that you're gonna see in the volume, so you can play with those settings. The look is however you want to define it, so it's by your likings. If the smoke is white or if the smoke is brown, you can use those colors, and it's your preferences here, so you can play with those colors and do it by your likings. And the shadow color, make sure you always put it to white because that's how it will generate the shadows. After this, I just to check the output. Yes, usually you need the density, the temperature, you need the velocity if you want to generate a motion blur at the end, and color or the flame if you need it. Those are optional and your likings. So you don't have to export every time everything because those are pretty heavy, especially the velocity field. It's pretty heavy, so if you don't have the need for it to be generated and exported as an output, please leave it just for the density field to be exported. And you can blast, because if you remember, we mentioned it in some of the previous videos, that actually the volumes are made out of primitives, So the velocities are not, and the temperature and density are not actually attributes. They're like separate primitives that you can blast or delete, or you can manipulate them as a complete geometry. So in this case, I'm just to clean everything up and to generate smaller size cache. I'm always blasting only the density because in the final render I'm not using the motion blur, so I choose only the density from here and delete non-selected. So if you middle click, you can see that only the density is here. Then I delete all the attributes that are created from this field. Actually, it's the look of the volume, because this one actually creates the color of the volume, and it creates the density, the strength of the density value, and other attributes. So I want everything to be deleted. I will need at least 2 frames to generate this. And now you can see that I don't longer have those attributes that I'm having here, detail attributes. So now we have clean mesh, and I am only keeping the color, and yeah, that's all that I'm keeping. Sometimes I even delete the color because this can overwrite even your shader settings, so whatever you put in your material sometimes can be overwritten by this one. So make sure you delete those values. And I convert the VDB. I convert the volume to VDB, and I also put it always on a primitive node, which gives me an option to save this VDB as a 16-bit float. And this gives me an extra compression on the volume cache. And this is the node that I use for the output. Usually for this node, I create in the out network, I create a geometry node, and I read right from those from that part of the network, and I generate an output out of it. So this is my setup for the volume volume that I'm generating on the surface. And on the other hand, we have also the rocks. Rocks actually are made on the similar way. I'm using also the legs from the girl. I'm using just a smaller portion, and I am also applying the trailing for computing the velocity, and I also have the double surface behind it just to have like bigger surface with which she is interacting. And we already said that we don't need the active because we're not really using it. So we have the grid, we have the same scattering. I'm transferring the points from the the velocity from the girl to the ground, and I'm deleting all the points that have velocity length that is lower than 0.2. You can put 0.5. This totally depends on you. And yeah, but this mask is pretty harsh, so whatever point has either has velocity or don't have it. So it just removes the 0 velocity points. And after this I randomize the velocity as I did it previously. Just make sure that you have the velocity pointing upwards, not to point the velocities to go underneath the ground, just in that direction. Just make sure you're looking with the velocities upwards. And now I'm creating from those same points, I'm creating particles, and you can see that she's generating some particles out of it. They don't bounce a lot, so I control their bounce. I have around 1,000, and life expectancy, because they're solid bodies, they will continue living, so they live forever. The attributes, as you can see, they inherit the velocity that we have. With this you can play, and I have a small variance of 0.3. I use the pop drag just to keep them lower next to the ground, not to fly off that much. And I also have the gravity field, and I have the girl as a collision body, as you can see it here. And make sure you just use the object transform, because she is deforming every frame, so and use the deforming geometry. Here you can use either to use the surface as a collision or the volume, but because I'm not sure that this is closed volume, so most of the times I'm using the surface, or you can just use solver defaults. It chooses the both, so wherever there is volume it will use the volume, where there is no closed volume it will use the surface. And that's my output for the rocks. And those rocks have randomized p-scale. So I use the attribute randomize just to randomize the scale of the points a little bit, because we're gonna use copy to points. I'm generating this sphere, creating mountain just to give it a bit more shape to it. It's like a rock. It looks like a rock. And I'm transforming it just to be smaller, and I'm copying to points. Actually, I'm copying to the points that are created, and you can see that now I have randomized sized rocks. You can even randomize the rotation here and just play a little bit, not to have so uniformly rocks, but those were pretty small, so it's not really visible, their rotation. And I created a null node that is actually going to my output, and it's creating the rocks. So as you can see, this is the node that is connected to my output. And actually this is the whole setup for the scene and my simulation. And I create just 3 lights, which they gave me. One of them, in a way it's like three point lighting, but actually it's constructed from one environment light, one orange light that is from the back, and just to give more definition on the volume. And the other one is more like a bluish light from this side, and it's a bit more subtle than the orange one. You can see that the domination one, it's the orange one, and it gives just a nice contrast to the volume, and you can see all the nice shapes there that exist. And that's the output that I used for my mantra rendering. And I just created one material for the rocks and one material for the volume, which is the Pyro Advected shader, just to double check it. And yes, it's a small color, we define it, but as I mentioned, the small color, it's taken from the object file, so you should be careful with those nodes. The same will happen if you put a Pyrobake volume. This node, if you put it here at the end of your network, it will generate a shader. If you see, here is a checked assign material, and this shader, whatever you see in the viewport, actually it's gonna be on the render. So this, in a way, it's your shader at the end. So this is overwriting your material that you're gonna put that you're gonna apply on this geometry. So be careful when you put nodes like this. And if you see, look, now, even though I clean all the attributes, after the Pyrobake volume, you can see that there are those nodes that define the look of the volume, and they will return with this node. And yes, that is how I created this this interaction, ground interaction, and I just split it, the 3 elements for rendering. Now those are reading directly from the output nodes, just the caches. So here are the caches, here are the render node. As you can see here, I'm overwriting my, you can overwrite your material, or you can use whatever outside material. Here is the rock, here are the rocks, so I'm reading the cache geometry also from the output, and I'm just putting an output node. This output node will make sure whenever you go outside of this geometry node, it will always show this as a render node. So even if you have clicked on this one, when you go outside, it's gonna show the last node, the output node. And in the character, I'm using the animation, as you already seen, and I also applied the computing velocities with the trailing, just to have the motion blur on the girl. And that's it. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.